Hello, MAGFest. Okay, so everybody, thank you for coming right on down. This is the Sanrio you never knew. My name is Matthew Jaffino, and I will be your panel presenter for today. Okay, so basically, what this panel is about is I'm going to be talking about a little-known period in Sanrio's history that most people don't know about, and they made works that ran very much counter to what you usually know them for, and why they're so worth checking out. So with that said, let us begin the panel. Now, first of all, obvious question, but we just need to set this just to get the ground rules down. What is Sanrio? Sanrio is a merchandising company that markets cute character goods. They have a wide range of characters, the most famous being Hello Kitty, but also things like the Strawberry King, Buttsmaru, and a whole host of others. Oh, and I would be remiss to not mention Agretzko. They are one of the most profitable and successful companies in the world, and I would bet you a substantial amount of money that there isn't a country in the world that doesn't know what Sanrio is. But however, Sanrio didn't initially start out as a gigantic success. It actually started as a much different company, so let us go down that hole right now. Now, Sanrio started life as the Yamanashi Silk Company in 1960 by a businessman named Shintaro Tsuji. Initially, the company sold silk and gifts. However, the gifts started to outsell the silk, so Tsuji eliminated that aspect. Publishing and greeting card divisions followed soon after, and these divisions immediately took off, resulting in great wealth and success. In 1973, YSC changed its name to Sanrio, and the year after, they invented Hello Kitty. The rest, as they say, is history. Now, Sanrio was flush with a lot of cash at this point, but there was one thing that Shintaro Tsuji wanted to do more than anything else. He wanted to make films, because he loved films, and he loved cartoons, and he loved animation. And he was, in fact, very fond of Disney. In 1974, Sanrio created a film production studio and distribution company, Sanrio Eiga, which in Japanese means Sanrio Films, to make and distribute animated and live-action films. As I said before, this was a long-held dream for Shintaro Tsuji. And the reason why is because around 1955, give or take, Shintaro Tsuji saw Fantasia in his 20s, and he was utterly blown away by it. Because in my mind, Fantasia is not only one of the greatest animated films ever made, it's one of the greatest films, period. My theory is that Sanrio tried to become the Walt Disney of Japan, actually. Because judging by the kinds of animated films they made around this time, not to mention how gigantic their footprint was in Japanese culture, I think those elements give credence to this theory. Before we move forward, I just want to actually say we're not actually going to talk about the live-action movies because, A, we don't have enough time for that, and not only do they not fit the purview of this panel, they're not that good. So with that said, let's actually move on with that. However, I think I need to answer a couple questions. What makes a Sanrio Films movie special, and why are they worth tracking down? The fact they ever made these movies is utterly bizarre, because given their image today, you would never know Sanrio made them unless someone told you, based on how dark and challenging they are. There is a consistent use of full animation in them, because unlike any anime made before or since, these films had full animation. And what I mean by that is that anime back in the day, and still to this day, use what is called limited animation, because even though they have a lot of money, they like to save money. And it ends up not making the animation look as good as usual. I mean, we're used to it, but it doesn't look anything like a Pixar or a Disney movie at all. And the reason for that is because Tsuji actually hated limited animation, and he wanted his films to be beautiful on technical and aesthetic levels, which these movies are. Quality was always king and never condescended to its audience, because if I may just say this for a second, it seems that except for Pixar and sometimes Disney, very few feature animation companies take chances or treat their audiences seriously based on what themes and storylines are present in these films. Shintaro Tsuji wanted the stories told to be emotionally resonant and memorable. Tsuji always went out of his way to hire talented creators for all his productions. And even if you're not somebody who pays attention to who makes what you watch, the people who worked on these were masters of their craft. Now, I promise we're going to get to the film soon, but I need to point out a couple people because they're going to be brought up a lot, and you really should be familiar with who they are. This is a man named Takashi Yanase. He was one of the most beloved creators of children's entertainment in Japanese history. Most famous for creating a superhero known as Anpanman in 1973. Now, the deal with Anpanman is that he is a character with an anpan, aka a red bean paste bun, for a head who feeds starving children while also protecting the world from an evil germ named Baikenman. He grew up in Taipei during World War II to a poor and starving family, which not only went into the creation of Anpanman, but it also went into everything else he did around that same time. Sadly, he passed away in 2013, and Japan wept that day because I mean, we have things like the Hungry Hungry Caterpillar. Japan had Anpanman, and it was a huge blow. The next person to know is a man named Masami Hata. He is one of the oldest and most respected directors of anime in Japanese history. He began his career at Osamu Tezuka's Mushi Productions. Osamu Tezuka, for those who don't know, we'll get into him in a second, but he was often known as the god of anime and manga because pretty much without him, anime and manga would not exist where it is today. Hata was, for the most part, Sanrio's in-house director of their anime, and he was really good at it, too. He worked steadily through every decade of anime, and he's still working today, actually. I mean, most recently, he worked on Dororo and Hyakimaru, and also JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. So, and he is actually, this is a bit of a side note, but the founder of Studio Mappa, he said that Hata is the only person in the anime industry he refers to as sensei. Like I mentioned before, Osamu Tezuka. Now, this man is one of the most important people in Japanese animation comics in history. He was the creator of Astro Boy, Kimba the White Lion, Blackjack, and many more manga and anime that endured to this day. And if you ever want to see or read it, all this stuff is readily available. I highly recommend you go check them out because at least one of them will blow your mind. And he actually worked a lot with Sanrio, and we'll get into that in a second. Now, I've stalled long enough, so let us get to the Sanrio films. The first thing they released was a double bill called Joe and the Rose and Little Jumbo. These were the first animated productions by Sanrio, and they released on a double bill. Both were written by Takashi Yanase. Now, Joe is a simple story about love that ends tragically, and Little Jumbo, you won't believe me when I tell you this, is an anti-war parable that plays upon Yanase's common themes. In other words, the effects of war on the innocent, starvation, etc. And you wouldn't think that just based on the image on the right over there. It set the standard for the rest of Sanrio's animated films. Now, I'm going to show you a clip now, and the way this and most of the other clips will work is that I'm going to show two scenes from each of these works. The first will usually be cute and typical of how we view Sanrio. The other is more in line with what I'm talking about. In other words, darkness, lavish animation, and so on.
ジョーはまだ小さい子犬の頃からバラの花の下で遊ぶのが好きでした。ジョーはバラの花に言いました。僕はバラのことがすっごく好きさ。君のそばにいると僕は心の中が幸せになる。バラは微笑みながら答えました。私もよ、ジョー。あなたの黒い丸い団子花がとても好きよ。本当かな。君は美しいが、僕はみっともないからな。
僕は宿なしの汚れた犬だ。君は美しい真っ赤なバラの花。あんまり違いすぎる。バラは風に歌った。私はジョーが好きよ。心の底から好きよ。 バラの花と女王バラの花と女王
ジョー、危ない。ジョー、素敵。そうさ、僕は強いんだ。はあ、ジョー、ジョー、ジョ
僕は象使いのバル象の名前はジャンボ僕らはジャンボとバルジャンボとバルお辞儀をするんだジャンボジャンボ逆立ちするんだジャンボジャンボちんちんまいぞジャンボジャンボかわいいジャンボ
Starting to see what I'm talking about? Now we come up to, this is special, called Chirin no Suzu, or Ringing Bell. This is a short film that was released in 1978 along with an American co-production called The Mouse and His Child, which it's based on a kid's book, and it was actually a co-production between Sanrio and a studio called Murakami Swenson, aka the studio that animated the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. And we're not going to cover The Mouse and His Child because A, we don't have enough time, and B, it's actually not that good. This is actually based on a children's book written by Takashi Yanase. It was released in America as Ringing Bell, and it is a story about a lamb named Chirin who lives an idyllic life in a pasture until his mother is slaughtered by a wolf. Not wanting to accept that this will become his fate in life, he pursues the wolf and demands that the wolf train him to become a wolf with disastrous consequences. This was also directed by Masami Hata. Honestly, this is one of the darkest and most emotionally traumatic animated works ever made. And what I mean by that is that Ringing Bell is a fairy tale in the classic sense a la the Brothers Grimm. And granted, it's not nearly as gory or needlessly cruel as those fairy tales of old, but the point is, it is a harsh story with disturbing imagery that has an important moral and or lesson to impart, which I believe is valuable to show children at an appropriate age. The lesson being the dangers of conformity and how what you want might not necessarily be the best choice for you and could end up negatively affecting your life. And you've got to see this because it'll blow your freaking mind. So let's take a look at that.
私の大事な坊や。
僕が割ってしまったんだ。こんな小さな小鳥の赤ちゃんを殺してしまったんだ。僕がどうしてなんだ。どうして弱い者は死んじゃうんだ。どうして
誰かが生きるためには誰かが死ぬ。それが野生の掟。わかるかチリン。死ぬか生きるか、ここは戦いだけの世界だ。
だって僕には狼のような牙もなければ鋭い爪もない。戦うことなんてできない。
そんなお前がなぜ狼になろうとしたのだ。
悔しかったんだ。牧場の小さな小屋の中でこそこそ生きていくだけなんて嫌だ。僕は何もしないで殺されて死ぬなんて嫌だ。でも
泣くがいい。その悔しさがやがてお前の牙になる。
牙？僕の牙？
そうだチリン。生きることは悲しみを知ること。その悲しみで心の牙を研ぐのだ。
心の牙。それがあれば強くなれるんだね。ウオみたいに強くなれるんだね。
ついてくるがいい。俺が狼の生き方を教えてやる。分かっているなチリン。この世界はいつも死がつきまとう地獄だ。覚悟はできているな。
地獄へ落ちても構わない。命だって美味しくない。ウオ、僕は狼よりも強くなってお前をやっつけてやる。
Yeah, absolutely extraordinary. And if you're going to take something away, track this down. It's incredible. However, Sanrio puttered along pretty well until this point, but it wasn't until they hit gold with this. In 1978, Sanrio produced a documentary called "Who Are the DeBolts and Where Did They Get 19 Kids?" This is a documentary about a family who adopted children who are disabled in a multitude of ways. It could be physical disabilities, mental disabilities. They adopted all the kids that nobody would ever pick up at the orphanage because they weren't like perfect or they just couldn't deal with it. And it's a very beautiful story, to be honest. This ended up winning the Academy Award for Best Documentary Feature in 1979. And it solidified Sanrio's status as a film studio because I will say this, though. It's well worth watching, but I don't think it's that great because the film is of its time and a little too treacly for its own good. But I still think it is well worth tracking down. It's not too hard to find on YouTube. And I'm just going to actually show you what the trailer of this is like, and I think you'll get the idea.
You know, being a mother of 19 can be pretty hilarious. I'm always tearing around, as you can well imagine. And one day, not too long ago, the phone rang and I grabbed it, and this little boy said, "Mom, this is Jennifer. Can I go up to the playground?" And I said, "Sure, honey, but be home by 5 o'clock. I hung up the telephone and I remembered we don't have a kid named Jennifer. When you have a family which is very small, you have a few children, you're inclined to make great big mountains out of all sorts of molehills. I know, because I had a few children for a couple of years. And every moment was spent worrying about whether the kid was going to fall down or whether he was going to breathe when he was an infant and all this stuff. The moment the numbers of children grew, those really insignificant and unimportant things were ignored to focus in on the more important needs of the child.
Like I said, it's of its time, but it's a very beautiful story. Now, we get to where Sanrio starts to put out the big guns. This is the saga of Metamorphoses. Now, this is Sanrio's first big movie, and they wanted this to be their calling card in both Japan and America, more so America than Japan, to make them a force to be reckoned with, and wanted to take over the struggling American theatrical animation industry. Now, you got to remember at this point, Disney was not doing very well at that time, and they made a lot of films that, well, a lot of people have fondness for them. It wasn't up to the caliber of previous decades. And essentially, this was Sanrio, and by extension, Shintaro Tsuji's first attempt at making a classic Disney-style animated film. This was essentially an attempt to emulate Fantasia, but with pop and rock music. It's actually based on a book of poems by the Roman poet Ovid. And the original release featured a soundtrack from people like the Rolling Stones, Joan Baez, and the Pointer Sisters, which is crazy. It was a complete and critical financial failure. It premiered to great fanfare in 1978, immediately savaged by critics and confused and bored all who saw it. Sanrio immediately pulled it from release. It's actually impossible to see that original version today. However, Sanrio was determined to not give up, and they retooled the film and tried again with a new release in 1979. They retitled it to Winds of Change, removed all the pop and rock music, and replaced it with a disco soundtrack by Alucard Considinos. And they also added narration by the great British actor Peter Ustinov to explain the plot that confused people the first time around, but it only serves in him just saying what's actually happening on screen. Like, I know, I'm seeing this. This was, once again, critically panned and bombed everywhere. This actually is the only way to see this film. I'm actually going to show you a clip. It's actually the very, very end of the movie, and it doesn't resolve anything at all. And I think the animation looks nice, but it just doesn't make sense, and the music doesn't fit. So let's take a look at it.
Yes, the road to hell again. Dad did mention the reflection of sunlight from the water. Sense tells this noble animal that something is wrong here. Hey, horses, there's the problem. A kid at the reins, a shaver, an amateur, a donkey driver, a crazy back there. We'll show the whippersnapper a thing or two. He's not going to control us.
Got a hot shot of trouble inside me. Ain't got no time to panic or pray. It's like it's all night. Gotta find me, drive me, burn me away. All my lifeline is turning to lava, and it's burning my body and soul. 'Cause it's all that I know. It's a fire that's rolling out of control. Red hot river of fire. Red hot river of fire. Fire. Red hot river of fire. Red hot river of fire. I can take you. No turning around on forever. It'll shake you. Follow me now down the river. River of down. I get swept up and swallowed forever. And I feel like a tower of flame. It's the part of me that the silence of falling, calling my name. Are the red blazes raging inside you? You belong in this river with me. I'm after your soul, let the fire enfold you, burning you free. Red hot river of fire. Red hot river of fire. Fire.
There he goes. The same actor who you saw in the starring roles of Perseus, of Actaeon, and Orpheus, and Mercury. But now he's a falling star. Not a bad way to go.
End movie. So yeah, you can see why this didn't work.
Was he okay?
I'll let you figure that out for yourself.
He's fine.
Anyway, now we're gonna get on to something that's actually really, really good. Nutcracker Fantasy. This is a stunning stop-motion puppet film. And it nominally adapts E.T.A. Hoffman's story and Tchaikovsky's ballet about the Nutcracker. This was actually made with the assistance of people who worked on Rankin and Bass stop-motion Christmas films, such as Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer and so on. It embraces the darkness of Hoffman's original fairy tale. It was released in America and Japan simultaneously, which is a rarity for Sanrio, completely ignored upon release everywhere, which is a real shame because This is an absolutely wonderful movie, and I'll tell you where you can get it near the end of the panel, but take a look at this.
ヤンカリンって言いますのはね、恐ろしい魔法の杖を持ってましてね、夜が更けてもまだ寝てない子供がいるとそーっと部屋に忍び込んで、その子をネズミに変えてしまうんですよ。
まあ、本当？
本当ですとも。
さあ、私のマルチパンジョへ行きましょう。
I should also point out is that through a lot of these films, cameos from other characters from Sanrio's back catalog also appear, but they don't take up a significant amount of time. They're just little fun, cute Easter eggs for fans of Sanrio.
So I know you said that was dark, but Jesus!
Just wait. Now we get to, this is actually one of my favorite things to come out of here. It's called Unico. Now, Unico was originally created by Osamu Tezuka in 1976 as a manga at Sanrio's request, and it was serialized in a magazine called Lyrica, which is a full-colored monthly magazine published by Sanrio at the time, and that kind of thing is still unheard of by today. Now, actually, the story of Unico is essentially, it's about a baby unicorn who is born with the ability to make other people happy, something that does not sit well with the gods. Because of this, they summon the personification of the West Wind to kill Unico. Refusing to comply with their orders, the West Wind instead takes Unico to parts unknown with his memory erased. Inevitably, Unico makes others happy, and to prevent Unico from suffering the wrath of the gods, takes him away to another place with his memory erased. Other than Unico's actual adventures, this is largely the premise of each story of Unico. Now, the first Unico anime was an unsold pilot for a TV show made in 1979. It didn't get released in Japan until years later, when it was released on VHS in the late 80s, and is in fact based on a story from the manga. It then got a feature-length movie in 1981 called Fantastic Adventures of Unico, and it is an anthology film that is based on two stories from the manga, one about Unico befriending a lonely young demon, and the other about Unico protecting a girl who is under threat by a sinister baron. Followed up with a sequel in 1983 called Unico in the Island of Magic. The second movie, it has an original story that was not based on the manga, but Osamu Tezuka actually wrote it. It is significantly darker and more messed up than the previous two anime, and I'm just going to point out when we get to the Island of Magic, if you're wondering, is that what the castle is made of? Yes. Yes, it is.
お前の歌を聴かせてくれる約束だったな。甘いワインで喉を潤せ、そして早く歌を聴かせてくれ。
いい香り。
もっと飲むんだ。さあ飲め。いくらでも飲め。
これね、牧場で付き合ってたドラ猫から習ったの。いい歌でしょ。お腹空いちゃった。かつぶしスープ飲みたい。
面白い娘だ。せいぜい今のうちに幸せな夢でも見るがいい。
さあおいで。こっちこっちよ。早く早く、ユニコ。いい？これからはお友達よ。どんなことがあっても私たちの友情は永遠に変わらないことをここに誓う。はい、握手。おいで。
こんなところにいたのね。港には船が待っているのよ。おや、そこに人間がいるじゃないか。
この人たちは違うんです。
生き人形にちょうどいいこと。よーく見ておいで、トルビー。あとこのうちには人間いないのかい？
いません。
さあお急ぎ。村中の人間を生き人形にするのだよ。怠けないでおやり、トルビー。
So that's that. These are actually really good movies, and I would highly suggest you all track them down. Now we actually come to, this is my favorite of all of the things that Sanrio's made, and it actually remains to be one of my most favorite anime movies ever, actually. It's called The Legend of Sirius, otherwise known as Sea Prince and the Fire Child. This was Sanrio's next big project after the failure of Metamorphosis. This is 1981 film is a fairy tale adaptation of Romeo and Juliet. It was released in America as Sea Prince and the Fire Child, and this was actually directed by Masami Hata, and it's actually his best film, in my opinion. Not to mention one of the most lavish and stunningly animated films I've ever seen. Lavish animation and heart-rending emotion are at the heart of this film. It is a full-on tragedy that does not pull any punches, despite ostensibly being for a family audience. It is a fairy tale in the way that Hans Christian Andersen wrote fairy tales, wherein tragedy was inevitable, but it was not without reason. This also was a box office failure. I believe we're starting to see a trend here. I'm only going to show you the opening sequence since A, we're short on time, and B, it'll show off the stunning animation from what I'm talking about, so just be prepared.
昔この世界は火と水でできていたのじゃ。火と水はとても仲のいい姉と弟でな、いつも一つの塊となって混沌と混じり合っていたのじゃ。ところがそれを羨んだ風の怪物アルゴンが二人を仲違いさせてやろうと企んでの、火と水がお互いに憎しみ合うようなひどい噂を流したんじゃ。それを耳にした火と水はすっかりその噂を真に受けてしもうた。今までとびっきり仲が良かっただけに、一度まかれた疑惑の種は二人の心に深く根を下ろし、やがてその悲しみは怒りへと変わり、さらに強い憎しみへと変わっていったんじゃ。それからというもの、火は陸へ、水は海へとたむとを分かち、二人は二度と会うこともなくなってしまったのじゃ。
アルゴンが暴れているのであろう。海の魔王グラウコス、またしても海を治めることを怠ったな。そのために波は逆まき、船は沈む。容赦できぬ。もう容赦できぬぞ。皆の者、早速火分けの儀式じゃ。海の一族よ、このかがり火の燃えている限り、お前たちの勝手にはさせぬ。夜をも支配する我が非一族の力を知るがよい。
utterly stunning, and I still get chills every time I see that scene. I absolutely love it. Now we go to Sanrio Films' last hurrah, Fairy Florence, or A Journey Through Fairyland. Released in 1985, this was the last film made by Sanrio Films. It was released in America on VHS in the late 80s as A Journey Through Fairyland. It's a story about a boy named Michael who cares more about tending flowers than his music school curriculum. When he's removed from the orchestra for not dedicating enough time to his music studies, that night he has a dream where a fairy named Florence takes him to a land of flowers and music, where he rediscovers his love for music. This was directed by Masami Hata. This took over 4 years to make, and it is possibly one of the most beautiful animated films ever made. This is one of the few films where it was animated on ones, meaning every frame that was animated had something different happening, something that is unheard of either then or since in any kind of animation, which is insane. Because in a world where people who categorize films as either about characters or story, this is a film where the music and the spectacle are the most important aspects of the film. This film, more than any other, owes the most to Fantasia's influence. It's quite possibly the film that Shintaro Tsuji had always wanted to make, even though it is derivative of Fantasia much of the time. Regardless, it's still good. This also was a horrendous failure at the box office. So I'm just actually going to show you a clip, and I think you'll see what I mean. Stunning, simply stunning. The death of Sanrio Films. After Fairy Florence's failure, Shintaro Tsuji liquidated Sanrio Films in 1985. Never again would Sanrio make films with the experimental beauty and risk-taking films that define all of Sanrio Films' work. Shintaro Tsuji took the failure of Sanrio Films with bitter resentment and sadness. And the reason why is because Tsuji desperately wanted to make films on the level and quality of the golden age of Disney animation, only to be met with indifference by both the audience and the critics. And additionally, if you can possibly believe it, this always put Sanrio in the red. And that's shocking because Sanrio is one of the most profitable companies in the world. Sanrio then transitioned into making TV animation solely starring their mascot characters through the use of limited animation. Now, I just want to preface this and say, I don't think that the stuff they've made afterwards is lesser than the films I've shown. I'm just saying it's different, and it's such a marker of how much they changed following Fairy Florence's failure. These were far more profitable and successful. However, I would like to end on this actually, because it's something really interesting. The very next year, a little studio known as Studio Ghibli released their very first film, Laputa, otherwise known as Castle in the Sky. Studio Ghibli would go on to essentially accomplishing every thing Sanrio films set out to do without breaking the bank in the process. Now, there's no evidence of this. I have to wonder if Shintaro Tsuji was ever jealous of Studio Ghibli for doing what he wanted to do when he made films. We'll probably never know, though, because Tsuji is a very, very old man now, and I'll be surprised if he lives another 10 years or so. But it's just, some food for thought right there. Now, where can you see these? Now, the one place to find a lot of these is from Discotek Media, which is, in my mind, one of the truly best anime publishers today, as they release older animation and anime, in addition to high-quality anime from this era as well. Most of Sanrio's films are available to buy from them. Prime and Crunchyroll are where you can see these films via streaming, although largely dubbed, but I'm pretty sure you can see them in Japanese on Crunchyroll. Whereas Right Stuff is where you can buy them on physical media if that is your preference. Unfortunately, Joe and the Rose, Little Jumbo, and Winds of Change are not available to legally purchase in the USA, so you must go through other means to watch them. Thank you so much, guys, for coming.